Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. Deep in the heart of the Missouri Ozarks, where ancient limestone ridges cast long shadows and morning mist clings to forgotten hollows, there exists a story that has been deliberately buried for over a century. It's a tale that local families refuse to speak of, even in whispers. A story so unsettling that entire communities conspired to erase it from history itself. The year was 1909. And in the remote backwoods of Shannon County, children were given one absolute rule that superseded all others. Never, under any circumstances, approach the old stone well that sat in the darkest part of Dead Man's Hollow. Parents would grow pale at the mere mention of it, crossing themselves and changing the subject with nervous haste. The well had earned its name through decades of whispered warnings. They called it the Forbidden Well, and for good reason. Local folklore claimed that those who dared to peer into its depths would vanish without a trace, or worse, return forever changed, speaking in hushed tones of things that dwelt in the darkness below. Newspaper clippings from the late 1800s, yellowed and brittle with age, contained scattered references to strange disappearances near what they only described as the old well in the hollow. But these reports would grow increasingly scarce as the years passed, as if an invisible hand was deliberately silencing the press. The Ozark Mountains of 1909 were a world unto themselves, isolated from the rapid modernization sweeping across America. These were communities where electricity remained a distant dream, where horse-drawn wagons still navigated treacherous mountain paths, and where superstition and folklore held as much weight as scientific fact. The landscape itself seemed designed to harbor secrets. Vast cave systems honeycombed the limestone bedrock, sinkholes appeared overnight to swallow entire trees, and underground rivers flowed through chambers that had never seen sunlight. Towns like Eminence, West Plains, and the settlements along the Current River were populated by hardy farming families who had carved out their existence from the unforgiving terrain. These were people who understood that the mountains kept their own counsel, and that some places were simply not meant for human exploration. The thick forests could swallow a person whole, and the maze of hollows and ridges could disorient even the most experienced woodsman. It was into this world of isolation and whispered warnings that the Bellamy family had settled, purchasing a modest farm on the outskirts of what locals simply called the Hollow. The land came cheap, perhaps suspiciously so, but times were hard, and Jacob Bellamy couldn't afford to question fortune when it presented itself. His wife Martha had expressed reservations about the property's proximity to the old well, but Jacob dismissed her concerns as mountain superstition. The Bellamys had 3 children: Sarah, age 15, Thomas, 12, and little Mary, just 8 years old. They were good children, raised with proper respect for the dangers of mountain life. They knew not to wander too far from the farmhouse, to watch for sudden weather changes, and most importantly, to heed their parents' warnings about the forbidden areas of their new home. But curiosity is a powerful force in the mind of a 12-year-old boy, and Thomas Bellamy possessed more than his fair share of it. On a warm spring morning in April 1909, Martha Bellamy called for her son to come in for his midday meal. When Thomas failed to appear, she assumed he was off exploring their new property, perhaps fishing in the creek that wound through their land. But as the afternoon stretched into evening and there was still no sign of the boy, a cold dread began to settle in the pit of her stomach. Jacob organized a search party of neighboring farmers, men who knew every inch of the surrounding wilderness. They called Thomas's name until their voices grew hoarse, searched every cave entrance, every hidden grove, every possible place a young boy might have wandered. But as the hours turned to days, it became increasingly clear that Thomas Bellamy had simply vanished without a trace. It was old Henrik Müller, a German immigrant who had lived in the Hollow for over 30 years, who first dared to voice what others were thinking. "Have you checked near the well?" he asked in his heavily accented English, his weathered face grave with concern. The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and several of the search party members unconsciously took a step backward. Jacob Bellamy's face went white. In all their frantic searching, they had deliberately avoided that one place, as if by unspoken agreement. The very suggestion sent a chill through the group that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Sheriff Albert Whitfield of Shannon County was a practical man who prided himself on his logical approach to law enforcement. He had little patience for mountain superstitions and ghost stories, viewing them as obstacles to proper police work. When word reached him of the missing Bellamy boy, he assembled a proper search team equipped with ropes, lanterns, and grappling hooks, everything needed for a thorough investigation. The sheriff's first glimpse of the well filled him with an inexplicable sense of unease. It sat in a natural depression where the trees grew thick and the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy above. The well itself was constructed of fitted limestone blocks, clearly old, but still remarkably intact. There was something unsettling about its craftsmanship. The stones were carved with symbols that didn't match any architectural style Whitfield had encountered in his years of law enforcement. "Lower the lanterns," he commanded his deputies, trying to project more confidence than he felt. The first lantern descended on a length of rope, its flickering light revealing smooth stone walls that disappeared into impenetrable darkness below. The light seemed to be swallowed by the depths, providing illumination for only a few feet before the blackness consumed it entirely. As the search continued, strange details began to emerge. The air around the well grew noticeably colder the closer one approached, even on that warm April day. Deputy Marcus Webb reported that his pocket watch had stopped working when he leaned over the edge, though it resumed normal function once he stepped away. Most unsettling of all were the markings carved into the inner walls of the well, symbols that resembled no known writing system, etched deep into the stone as if by desperate clawing hands. When they finally lowered a grappling hook to drag the bottom, it caught on something substantial after descending nearly 60 feet. But when they attempted to pull it back up, the rope snapped with a sound like a gunshot, as if something below had deliberately severed it. A second attempt met the same fate, and Sheriff Whitfield found himself staring into those black depths with a growing sense that they were not alone. The mystery of the forbidden well stretched back far beyond the Bellamy family's arrival in the Hollow. Local records, scattered and incomplete, as they were, contained references to the well dating back to the earliest settlement of the region. Some claimed it had been built by the first European settlers in the 1820s, though others insisted it was far older, possibly predating white settlement entirely. The Cherokee and Osage tribes, who had once called the Ozarks home, had their own stories about the area. Tribal elders, in the few recorded interviews that survived, spoke of a place in the mountains where the earth had been wounded, and where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits grew thin. They warned that certain hollows should be left undisturbed, that some places held darkness that could never be fully contained. Newspaper archives from the St. Louis Globe-Democrat contained scattered reports throughout the 1880s and 1890s of strange occurrences in the remote Ozark counties, travelers who disappeared along mountain roads, livestock found dead with no apparent cause, and eerie sounds echoing through the hills at night. Local correspondents wrote of unnatural phenomena and unexplained vanishings, though their reports grew increasingly vague as the years passed, as if editors were reluctant to print stories that might be dismissed as backwoods folklore. One particularly chilling account, dated 1887, described the experience of a traveling minister named Reverend Joshua Caldwell, who had become lost in the mountains during a severe thunderstorm. Seeking shelter, he had stumbled upon what he described as an ancient well of peculiar construction, in a hollow where no birds sang and no insects buzzed. The Reverend claimed to have heard voices calling from within the well, not cries for help, but something far more disturbing, what sounded like a congregation singing hymns in a language he didn't recognize. When Caldwell had attempted to investigate further, lowering his lantern into the depths, he reported seeing what appeared to be carved chambers extending horizontally from the main shaft, as if the well was merely the entrance to a much larger underground complex. But before he could explore further, his lantern had suddenly been extinguished by what he described as a wind that rose from below, carrying with it the scent of things long dead. The Reverend's account might have been dismissed as the hallucinations of a man caught in a severe storm, but it aligned too closely with other reports to be ignored entirely. Throughout the 1890s, local families reported the mysterious deaths of farm animals that had wandered too close to the hollow. Cattle and horses would be found dead without any sign of injury or disease, their bodies showing an unusual condition that local veterinarians described as premature decomposition, as if the very life had been drained from them. In the weeks following Thomas Bellamy's disappearance, the atmosphere around the well grew increasingly oppressive. Neighbors reported strange sounds echoing across the hollow during the nighttime hours, not the natural sounds of the forest, but something far more unsettling. Some described it as knocking, as if someone was tapping against stone from within the well itself. Others swore they heard voices, though the words were always too distant and distorted to understand. Daniel Price, a farmhand who worked for the Muller family, claimed to have witnessed something that defied all rational explanation. While checking on livestock one evening in late April, he had been walking along the ridge that overlooked the hollow when he noticed an unusual glow emanating from the area around the well. Curious despite his better judgment, Price had crept closer through the trees until he had a clear view of the ancient structure. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. A pale, luminescent mist seemed to be rising from the well, and within that mist, Price swore he could see the outline of a human hand reaching upward from the depths, grasping at the air as if trying to pull itself out. The hand appeared and disappeared in the swirling vapors, sometimes seeming solid, other times translucent as moonlight. Price had fled the scene, but his story spread through the community like wildfire. Other residents began to come forward with their own encounters, brief glimpses of figures moving through the trees near the hollow, the sound of footsteps on paths where no one was walking, and most disturbing of all, the sensation of being watched whenever they passed near the forbidden area. Martha Bellamy, consumed with grief over her missing son, began keeping a vigil at the edge of the hollow. Night after night, she would sit on the ridge with a lantern, hoping against hope that Thomas might somehow find his way home. It was during one of these lonely watches that she claimed to hear her son's voice calling to her from somewhere far below the earth, pleading for help in a tone that broke her heart. Whether Martha's experiences were the product of grief-induced hallucinations or something more supernatural, her nightly vigils attracted the attention of others in the community. Some came to comfort the grieving mother, but others came because they, too, had begun to hear things in the darkness, voices that seemed to rise from the very ground itself, speaking in languages that predated human settlement of the region. As news of the strange occurrences spread beyond the immediate community, It attracted the attention of educated men who approached the mystery from a more scientific perspective. Dr. Elias Thornton, a geology professor from Drury College in Springfield, arrived in early May with a team of students and a collection of modern scientists, instruments that he believed would solve the mystery once and for all. Dr. Thornton was a man of the emerging scientific age, trained in the rational methodologies that were beginning to replace superstition and folklore as explanations for natural phenomena. He viewed the stories surrounding the well as classic examples of how isolated communities could transform ordinary geological features into objects of supernatural terror. His working theory was that the well was connected to one of the extensive cave systems that honeycombed the Ozark limestone, and that underground air currents were responsible for the strange sounds that had frightened the locals. The professor's initial examination of the well seemed to support his hypothesis. The limestone construction and the depth of the shaft suggested it had been built to access an underground water source, possibly during the early settlement period, when such wells were essential for survival in remote areas. The symbols carved into the walls, which locals had interpreted as supernatural markings, appeared to Thornton to be crude mason's marks or possibly early surveyors' notations. However, as Dr. Thornton's investigation progressed, he began to encounter phenomena that challenged his scientific worldview. When his team attempted to use surveying equipment to map the well's dimensions, their instruments consistently malfunctioned. Compass needles spun wildly when brought near the opening, and their carefully calibrated measuring devices produced readings that varied dramatically from one moment to the next. Most puzzling of all was what happened when they attempted to lower their newly acquired Edison phonograph into the well to record any sounds that might be echoing from below. The device descended normally for the first 30 feet, but at approximately the same depth where Sheriff Whitfield's grappling hooks had encountered resistance, the phonograph's recording mechanism began to produce sounds that Dr. Thornton would later describe in his private journals as impossible and deeply disturbing. The recordings, when played back on the surface, contained not the hollow echoes one might expect from a deep shaft, but what sounded like human voices speaking in overlapping conversations. The voices spoke in languages that none of Thornton's linguistically trained colleagues could identify, though the emotional content was unmistakably one of distress and pleading. Most unsettling of all, embedded within the chorus of unknown voices, was what sounded like a young boy calling for his mother. When Dr. Thornton attempted to retrieve the phonograph, he discovered that the retrieval rope had been severed at precisely the same depth where the previous equipment had been lost. The cut was clean and precise, as if made by a sharp blade, though nothing in the well's construction could account for such damage. The professor's scientific skepticism began to crumble entirely when his team attempted to illuminate the well's depths using a newly developed electric spotlight powered by a portable generator. The powerful beam should have been capable of illuminating the bottom of the shaft and revealing the source of the mysterious occurrences. But instead, the light seemed to be absorbed by the darkness itself, penetrating only a few feet before being completely consumed. Even more disturbing was what happened to the members of his team who looked directly into the illuminated depths. 3 of his graduate students reported seeing carved chambers and tunnels extending horizontally from the main shaft, just as Reverend Caldwell had described decades earlier. And they also claimed to see something else: human figures moving within those chambers, pale forms that seemed to be beckoning to them from the darkness. Dr. Thornton himself experienced the most disturbing encounter when he personally operated the spotlight. As he directed the beam downward, he reported seeing what appeared to be Thomas Bellamy standing on a ledge approximately 50 feet down, looking upward with an expression of desperate hope. The boy appeared solid and real, not like a hallucination or optical illusion, and he seemed to be trying to communicate something of vital importance. But when Thornton called out to the figure and attempted to lower a rope, the image had vanished, leaving him staring into impenetrable blackness that seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. The professor's investigation came to an abrupt end when one of his students, a young man named William Hayes, became convinced that he could communicate with whatever entities dwelt within the well. Against Dr. Thornton's explicit orders, Hayes had returned to the site alone one evening, bringing with him a collection of equipment designed to lower him into the shaft on a climbing harness. Hayes's screams echoing from the hollow brought the entire community running, but by the time they arrived, they found only his equipment scattered around the well's opening and no sign of the young man himself. A search of the surrounding area revealed no trace of Hayes, and when they lowered lanterns into the well, they found no evidence that he had ever descended into its depths. Dr. Thornton packed his remaining equipment and left the area immediately, but not before writing a detailed report of his experiences that he submitted to his colleagues at Drury College. The report was quickly suppressed by the college administration, who viewed its contents as professionally damaging to the institution's reputation for scientific rigor. Thornton himself never spoke publicly about his experiences in the Ozarks, though his private journals, discovered after his death, contained detailed drawings of the symbols he had observed in the well and extensive notes about his theories regarding what he termed localized dimensional anomalies. By late autumn of 1909, the community around Dead Man's Hollow had reached a breaking point. The disappearances of Thomas Bellamy and William Hayes, combined with the increasingly frequent reports of supernatural phenomena, had created an atmosphere of terror that was affecting every aspect of daily life. Families were keeping their children indoors after dark, livestock were being moved away from areas near the hollow, and several families had already made plans to abandon their farms entirely. It was in this climate of fear that a group of local men, led by Henrik Mueller and Sheriff Whitfield, decided to take definitive action. Their plan was simple but dangerous. They would seal the well permanently using heavy limestone blocks, effectively entombing whatever lay within its depths. The group consisted of 5 men: Mueller, Whitfield, Deputy Webb, a stonemason named Charles Garrett, and Daniel Price, the farmhand who had witnessed the mysterious hand reaching from the well. The men gathered their materials under cover of darkness, hoping to complete their work before word of their plans could spread through the community. They had chosen the night of November 15th, a date that would later prove to be significant for reasons none of them could have anticipated. The work began normally enough, using block and tackle equipment borrowed from the nearest railroad depot. They began lowering massive limestone slabs across the opening of the well. The stones were heavy enough that it would take considerable effort to move them, and the men believed that sealing the well in this manner would end the strange occurrences once and for all. But as they worked, the temperature around the well began to drop precipitously, far beyond what could be explained by the cool November air. Their breath began to steam, and frost formed on their equipment despite the relatively mild weather. More disturbing still, they could hear sounds rising from the well as they worked. Not the random echoes one might expect, but what sounded like organized protests, as if something below was objecting to their efforts. The sounds grew more intense as they placed each successive stone, evolving from wordless cries to what sounded like actual speech in languages none of them recognized. Deputy Webb later reported that the voices seemed to be pleading with them. Though he couldn't understand the words, the emotional content was unmistakable: fear, desperation, and anger. It was Charles Garrett who first noticed that their shadows, cast by the lanterns they had brought to illuminate their work, were behaving strangely. Instead of moving in correspondence with their bodies, the shadows seemed to be moving independently, reaching toward the well even when the men themselves were facing away from it. The stonemason pointed this out to his companions, and they all stopped their work to stare in horrified fascination at their own shadows, stretching unnaturally toward the opening they were trying to seal. As they placed the final stone, sealing the well completely, a sound erupted from below that none of them would ever be able to adequately describe. It was part scream, part howl, and part something else entirely, a sound that seemed to come not just from the depths of the well, but from the very earth itself. The sound was so intense that it shattered the glass chimneys of their lanterns, plunging them into complete darkness. In that darkness, something happened that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Daniel Price and Charles Garrett simply vanished, as if they had been plucked from the earth by invisible hands. One moment they were standing with their companions, and the next they were gone, leaving no trace behind except for the echo of their terrified screams. Henrik Mueller, Sheriff Whitfield, and Deputy Webb found themselves alone in the darkness, surrounded by the oppressive silence that followed the supernatural cacophony. When they finally managed to relight their lanterns, they discovered that the stone slabs they had so carefully placed over the well had been moved aside, as if by tremendous force from below. The well stood open once again, and from its depths came a sound that chilled them to the bone. What sounded like Daniel Price and Charles Garrett calling for help from somewhere far beneath the earth. The three survivors fled the scene immediately, and none of them ever spoke publicly about what they had witnessed that night. Sheriff Whitfield submitted a brief report stating that Price and Garrett had been killed in an industrial accident while working with heavy machinery, but the report contained no details and no witnesses were called to testify. The official cause of death was listed as accidental crushing, though no bodies were ever recovered. In the weeks that followed the failed sealing attempt, a coordinated effort began to erase all traces of the forbidden well from official records. Church leaders, local politicians, and newspaper editors seemed to work in unison to suppress any mention of the events that had taken place in Dead Man's Hollow. Articles about the missing persons were pulled from newspaper archives, official reports were sealed or destroyed, and families were pressured to remain silent about their experiences. The Bellamy family was quietly relocated to another county, with their farm being purchased by an anonymous buyer, who immediately abandoned the property. Maps of the area were redrawn to omit the hollow entirely, showing only unbroken forest where the well had stood. Even the name Dead Man's Hollow disappeared from official usage, with the area being redesignated simply as State Forest Land, Restricted Access. This systematic erasure of evidence was so thorough and coordinated that it suggested involvement at levels far above local government. Some historians have theorized that federal authorities may have been involved, possibly viewing the events as a threat to public order that required suppression. Others have suggested that the silence was maintained through more informal means, a community conspiracy born of genuine terror and the collective desire to forget something too horrible to remember. Martha Bellamy, who had lost her son to the well's mysteries, was reportedly paid a substantial sum of money in exchange for her agreement never to speak publicly about Thomas's disappearance. The payment came from a legal firm representing undisclosed clients, and Martha used the money to relocate her surviving children to California, where they lived under assumed names for the rest of their lives. Dr. Thornton's research notes and equipment were confiscated by college administrators and subsequently disappeared from the academic record. The professor himself was quietly transferred to a teaching position at a small college in Vermont, where he spent the remainder of his career studying conventional geology and never again venturing into areas that might be considered supernatural or unexplained. The three survivors of the sealing attempt maintained their silence until their deaths, though those who knew them well reported that all three men were permanently changed by their experience. Henrik Müller became increasingly religious, attending church services multiple times per week and speaking often about the need for spiritual protection against forces beyond human understanding. Sheriff Whitfield resigned his position within a year and moved away from the area entirely, though he continued to wake screaming from nightmares for the rest of his life. Deputy Webb developed a severe drinking problem and died young, reportedly haunted by visions of his missing companions calling to him from underground. But despite these coordinated efforts to bury the truth, the legend of the Forbidden Well refused to die completely. Isolated reports continued to surface over the decades. Hunters who claimed to have stumbled upon an old well deep in the state forest, hikers who reported hearing voices calling from beneath the ground, and local residents who insisted that certain areas of the mountains should still be avoided. In the 1950s, a team of federal surveyors working in the area reported discovering what appeared to be the remains of an old stone well, though their official report made no mention of the find, and the location was not marked on any subsequent maps. One member of the survey team, speaking anonymously years later, claimed that their equipment had malfunctioned when they attempted to investigate the structure, and that several team members had reported hearing voices rising from its depths. During the 1970s, an investigative journalist named Robert Chen attempted to research the history of disappearances in the Ozark Mountains and discovered tantalizing references to the events of 1909. However, when Chen tried to access official records, he found that most documents had been sealed or destroyed. Local residents refused to speak with him about the subject, and his investigation was ultimately abandoned when Chen himself disappeared while researching in the state forest. His body was never found, though his rental car was discovered abandoned on a logging road with all his research materials missing. More recently, internet forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena have contained scattered reports from hikers and campers who claim to have encountered something unusual in the remote reaches of the Missouri state forests. These reports, while lacking official verification, show remarkable consistency in their descriptions. An ancient stone well hidden in a hollow where the forest grows unnaturally quiet, strange sounds echoing from underground, and an overwhelming sense of malevolent presence that drives even experienced outdoorsmen to flee the area. Some of these modern reports include photographs, though the images are often blurry or inconclusive. However, several photos do appear to show stone structures that match historical descriptions of the Forbidden Well, suggesting that despite official denials, the site may still exist in some form. The question that haunts anyone who delves deeply into this mystery is not whether the events of 1909 actually occurred. The historical evidence, fragmentary though it may be, suggests that something extraordinary and terrifying did indeed take place in those remote Ozark Mountains. The more troubling question is why such extensive efforts were made to erase these events from history, and whether those efforts were successful. Today, more than a century after Thomas Bellamy's disappearance, the Missouri Ozarks remain one of America's most mysterious regions. The vast wilderness areas, with their complex cave systems and isolated valleys, could easily hide secrets that date back generations. And while official records may deny the existence of the Forbidden Well, the persistence of the legend suggests that some truths are too powerful to be completely suppressed. The story serves as a chilling reminder that there are still places in our modern world where ancient mysteries persist, where the boundary between the rational and the supernatural becomes dangerously thin. Whether one believes in the supernatural aspects of the tale or views it as an example of mass hysteria and coordinated cover-up, the Forbidden Well remains a testament to the power of fear and the lengths to which communities will go to bury truths too terrible to acknowledge. As the sun sets over the Ozark Mountains and darkness creeps through the hollows and valleys, one can't help but wonder, in those remote forests where no maps dare to venture and no official records acknowledge their existence, does the forbidden well still wait in patient silence, guarding secrets that were meant to remain buried forever? And if a modern-day explorer were brave enough or foolish enough to seek it out, would they find only crumbling stones and empty darkness? Or would they discover that some mysteries are forbidden for very good reason? The whispers that began in 1909 continue to echo through the mountains, carried on the wind through the hollows and caves, speaking of things that lie beneath the earth and wait in the darkness for the day when the seal is finally broken and the truth can no longer be contained. Until that day, the Forbidden Well remains what it has always been: a story told in hushed voices, a mystery deliberately erased from history, and a warning that some doors should never be opened, some depths should never be explored, and some wells should remain forever forbidden. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.